Approximately 3.5 million years ago, on an island in the Canadian high Arctic so far north that the sun disappears for months at a time, a large animal was walking through a boreal forest that no longer exists. The temperature was roughly 14 to 22 degrees Celsius warmer than it is today, warm enough to support large trees, birch, and a peat bog ecosystem across what is now one of the most inhospitable frozen landscapes on the planet. The animal moved through this forest on broad, flat feet that spread its weight across the soft ground. It carried its energy reserves in a concentrated mass on its back, a biological adaptation for surviving long stretches of polar darkness when food vanished. Its thick coat insulated it against temperature swings that could shift dozens of degrees in a single season. This was not a bear, it was not a moose, it was a camel. In 2006, paleontologist Natalia Rybczynski of the Canadian Museum of Nature began collecting bone fragments from the Files leafbed site on Ellesmere Island, deep inside the Arctic Circle. Over the next several years, her team recovered more than 30 pieces of a single large tibia, scattered across a steep slope above a river valley. The fragments were mineralized and fragile, but they were large, clearly from a substantial animal. Traditional morphological comparison was inconclusive because the fragments were too incomplete to match against a known skeleton. So Rybczynski's team turned to a technique that had never been applied to a fossil this old in the high Arctic: collagen fingerprinting. By analyzing the protein sequences preserved inside the bone mineral, they compared the chemical signature against a database of modern and fossil mammals. The result, published in Nature Communications in 2013, was unambiguous. The bone belonged to a camel, specifically a close relative of the modern dromedary and Bactrian camel, roughly 30% larger than any camel alive today, living at a latitude of 78 degrees north, 3.5 million years before the first human being would set foot on the Arabian Peninsula. That was 2013. Today, when you picture a camel, you picture sand. You picture the Sahara, the Arabian Desert, the scorching dunes of Central Asia. The image is so embedded in human consciousness that the camel has become synonymous with desert survival. The animal built for the wasteland, the ship of the desert. But that reputation is a product of the last few thousand years. The camel's actual story began not in a desert but in a swamp, not in Asia but in North America, and not millions of years ago but tens of millions. 45 million years before that tibia ended up on an Arctic hillside, a small mammal the size of a modern rabbit was moving through the subtropical forests of what is now South Dakota. Its name is Protolopus, and it is the oldest known ancestor of every camel that has ever lived. Protolopus had 4 toes, a short face, and a body that weighed roughly 2 to 3 kilograms, less than a house cat. There was nothing about this creature that suggested it would eventually produce descendants capable of crossing 1,000-kilometer deserts without water. It browsed low vegetation in a humid forest, and by every measure available to paleontology it was unremarkable. But the lineage it belonged to was anything but. Over the next 40 million years, the camelid family diversified across North America in ways that would seem almost absurd if the fossil record did not confirm them. By 35 million years ago, Pobrotherium had emerged, roughly the size of a modern goat, with longer legs and a more specialized dentition suited for browsing tough vegetation. By 20 million years ago, Epica mellis was standing over 3 meters tall at the shoulder, roughly the height of an African elephant's back, with a neck so elongated that early paleontologists mistook its fossils for a giraffe relative. This animal browsed the tops of trees across the Great Plains, a camel shaped like a giraffe, in a landscape that looked nothing like a desert. And the size range kept expanding. Titanotilopus, which survived until roughly 300,000 years ago, stood approximately 3.5 meters at the shoulder, taller than the tallest modern giraffe, and may have weighed well over a metric ton, heavier than a small car. North America during the Miocene and Pliocene was home to more species of camelid than any other continent on Earth. The diversity was so vast that it is almost impossible to reconcile with the 2 surviving species we know today. Because here is the detail that makes this story disorienting. Camels did not evolve in Asia, they did not evolve in Africa, they did not evolve anywhere near a desert. They evolved on a continent where they no longer exist, adapted to environments that no longer resemble anything we associate with camels, and then migrated to the places we now think of as their natural home. The migration happened in stages. Beginning approximately 7 million years ago, camelid species began crossing the Bering Land Bridge, the strip of exposed continental shelf that connected northeastern Asia to northwestern North America during periods of lower sea level. The genus Camels, a long-legged browser that had thrived across North America for millions of years, made the crossing and entered Central Asia. Its descendants would eventually split into two lineages over millions of years of geographic separation and climatic adaptation. One became the dromedary, the single-humped camel built for hot, arid environments. The other became the Bactrian camel, the two-humped species adapted to the cold, wind-blasted steppes and deserts of Central Asia. Both lineages arrived in their respective ranges long before human beings existed in any recognizable form. Meanwhile, back in North America, the camels stayed. Camelops, the last surviving North American camel, was a robust animal roughly the size of a modern dromedary, standing about 2 meters at the shoulder. It coexisted with mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and eventually the first human populations to cross the Bering Land Bridge in the opposite direction. The Clovis people and their predecessors would have encountered camelops on the grasslands of what is now the American Southwest. Camelops' bones have been found at sites alongside butchering tools. Some researchers believe that human hunting pressure, combined with the rapid climate shifts at the end of the Pleistocene, contributed to the camel's extinction in its homeland approximately 10,000 to 13,000 years ago. The continent where camels were born became the continent where they vanished. Every camel alive today exists only because an ancestor left North America millions of years before the continent killed off the rest of the family. And no, that is not an exaggeration. 0 wild camelids survive in North America. The llamas, alpacas, guanacos, and vicuñas of South America are the only New World camelids that made it, and they evolved from a separate branch that migrated south rather than west. And that Arctic fossil on Ellesmere Island adds a layer that fundamentally changes how biologists understand camel physiology. The features that make camels seem perfectly engineered for desert life. The broad, flat feet, the fat-storing hump, the dense, insulating coat, the ability to tolerate extreme temperature fluctuations of up to 6 degrees Celsius in body temperature without distress, may not have evolved for the desert at all. Rybczynski's team proposed that these adaptations originally served a very different purpose. Broad feet distribute weight on soft surfaces, which is as useful on snow and waterlogged peat as it is on shifting sand. A concentrated fat reserve on the back provides energy during long periods of limited food availability, which describes an Arctic winter with months of darkness just as accurately as it describes a crossing of the empty quarter. A thick coat insulates against extreme cold just as effectively as it reflects radiant heat. Even the camel's famous ability to fluctuate its own body temperature, a trait that conserves water by reducing the need to sweat, would have been advantageous in an environment where temperatures could swing from mild days to freezing nights. The camel did not adapt to the desert. The camel arrived in the desert pre-adapted, carrying a survival toolkit that had been assembled over millions of years in boreal forests, Arctic tundra, and cold grasslands. The desert simply happened to reward the same strategies that the far north had selected for. The broad foot that walked on snow now walks on sand. The hump that stored fuel for dark winters now stores fuel for waterless crossings. The coat that blocked Arctic wind now reflects Saharan sun. This is where the timeline stops making comfortable sense. Because the animal that would become the most important beast of burden in human history spent 45 million years evolving entirely without any input from human beings. It was shaped by ice ages, not by intent, by thinning forests, not by farmers, by climate shifts so vast and so slow that no single generation of any species could perceive them happening. The camel that eventually carried frankincense across the Arabian desert was designed, down to the unique oval shape of its red blood cells, by a world that humans never witnessed. And those red blood cells deserve a closer look because they reveal just how deep the engineering goes. Mammalian red blood cells are almost universally round and disc-shaped. The camels are oval. That shape allows them to flow smoothly through blood vessels, even when the blood is thick and viscous from dehydration, a condition that would cause round cells to clump and block capillaries. When a camel finally drinks after days without water, those oval cells can swell to 240% of their original volume without bursting. In most mammals, including humans, red blood cells rupture at around 150% expansion. That difference is the line between rehydration and death. A human who drank water as fast as a dehydrated camel, consuming roughly 200 liters in under 15 minutes, enough to fill a standard bathtub, would risk a condition called water intoxication that can cause fatal brain swelling. The camel's cells absorb the load and keep moving. Its kidneys produce urine so concentrated it has the consistency of syrup. Its intestines extract nearly every molecule of moisture from food before excretion. Its nasal passages contain scrolled, turbinate bones that recapture water vapor from exhaled breath. The entire animal is a water conservation system so sophisticated that modern engineers study it for insight into drought-resistant technologies. And every piece of this machinery was in place millions of years before any human being had a reason to cross a desert. That brings us to the central question of this story. When did this ancient, self-made animal first cross paths with the species that would claim ownership over it? And when it did, what actually happened between them? The earliest archaeological evidence of humans and camels sharing the same landscape comes not from the places you might expect. Rock art in the Arabian Peninsula depicting what appear to be wild dromedaries has been tentatively dated to roughly 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, deep in the Neolithic. At that time, the Arabian Peninsula was not the hyper-arid desert it is today. Paleoclimate records show it was significantly wetter, dotted with seasonal lakes, river channels, and grassland corridors that supported populations of wild ungulates, including gazelles, oryx, and almost certainly wild dromedaries moving between water sources. Those wild dromedaries were not the docile, long-lashed animals you see in tourist photographs. They were fast, skittish, aggressive, and adapted to flee from predators across open terrain. Their social structure revolved around a dominant male controlling a harem of females, a pattern still visible in feral dromedary populations in Australia today. The males fought viciously during breeding season, using their massive jaws to grab opponents by the leg or neck and wrestle them to the ground. Approaching a wild dromedary herd on foot, armed with Neolithic tools, would have been genuinely dangerous. And for thousands of years, that appears to be exactly what humans did. They hunted them. Camel bones appear at butchering sites across the Arabian Peninsula, dating from the early Holocene through the Bronze Age. Stone tools with wear patterns consistent with hide scraping have been found alongside dromedary remains. The relationship between humans and camels for most of their shared history was the same as the relationship between humans and any other large prey animal. We killed them and ate them. There is no evidence of management, no evidence of selective breeding, no evidence of any particular bond, just predator and prey. This is the part that keeps researchers debating, because at some point, that relationship changed. Humans stopped simply hunting wild dromedaries and started doing something far more complex. They began managing them, controlling their breeding, selecting for traits like milk yield and load-bearing capacity, and eventually riding them across distances that would have been impossible on foot. The question is how that transition happened. And the honest answer is that the evidence is incomplete enough that certainty remains out of reach. In 2016, Faisal Al-Mathan of King Faisal University in Saudi Arabia, working with an international team of geneticists, including Pamela Berger at the University of Veterinary Medicine in Vienna, published a landmark study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The team analyzed mitochondrial DNA from 1083 modern dromedaries sampled across the entire Old World from Morocco to India. The results were both clarifying and deeply unexpected. Al-Mathan's team found that modern dromedaries show remarkably high genetic diversity, far higher than what you would expect from a species that passed through a narrow domestication bottleneck. For comparison, domestic horses have extremely low mitochondrial diversity because they descend from a very small number of captured wild mares, possibly as few as a dozen distinct maternal lines. Domestic cattle also show reduced diversity. But dromedaries were different. Their genetic signature suggested that domestication involved a large number of wild individuals incorporated into domestic herds over an extended period, not a single capture event in one location. The implication was that dromedary domestication was not a sudden break. It was a slow, geographically diffuse, extended process in which wild animals were gradually absorbed into managed populations over centuries, possibly over more than 1,000 years. Some researchers have described it as a domestication continuum rather than a domestication event. There was no single moment when wild dromedaries became domestic dromedaries. There was a long, blurry gradient during which the line between wild and managed became increasingly difficult to draw. But Olmuthan's study revealed something else, something that shifts the entire conversation. The wild dromedary that served as the source population for domestication is completely extinct. There are no wild dromedaries anywhere on Earth. The feral populations in Australia, roughly 1 million animals roaming the outback across an area the size of Western Europe, are descendants of domestic camels imported by British colonists in the 19th century for use in exploration and freight hauling. They are domestic animals gone feral, not wild animals. The original wild dromedary, the animal that roamed the Arabian Peninsula before human management began, is gone. Its genes survive only inside the domestic animals that replaced it. Think about what that means for the question in this video's title. If camels chose to be domesticated, if they gravitated toward human settlements voluntarily the way wolves may have gravitated toward early human camps, then the extinction of the wild population might represent a voluntary migration. An animal that found the security and water access of human management preferable to wild existence and gradually abandoned the wild lifestyle altogether. But if we broke them in, if domestication was imposed through capture, confinement, and selective breeding, then the extinction of the wild population represents something more unsettling. It means we did not just domesticate an animal, we replaced it. Every wild dromedary that resisted management was eventually outcompeted by the domestic herds that grew faster, spread further, and consumed the same grazing land. The Bactrian camel, the two-humped species of the Central Asian steppes, offers a partial answer, and it complicates everything. Unlike the dromedary, the Bactrian camel does have a surviving wild relative. Camelus ferus, the wild Bactrian camel, still exists in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia and northwestern China. But the word exists requires immediate qualification. Fewer than 1,000 individuals remain, scattered across some of the most remote and inhospitable terrain on the planet. In the Lop Nor region of China and the Trans-Altai Gobi of Mongolia. The population is roughly the size of the student body of a single large high school. The International Union for Conservation of Nature lists it as critically endangered, one classification step away from extinction in the wild. And here is the detail that reframes the entire domestication debate. The wild Bactrian camel is not the ancestor of the domestic Bactrian camel. Genetic analysis led by Pamela Berger and colleagues at the University of Veterinary Medicine in Vienna demonstrated that the wild Bactrian camel and the domestic Bactrian camel diverged from a common ancestor approximately 700,000 to 1 million years ago. That is long before any domestication could have occurred. They are separate lineages that split apart during the Pleistocene. The domestic Bactrian camel was domesticated from a different, now extinct wild population, just like the dromedary. The wild Bactrian camels alive in the Gobi today are the last remnants of an older, more ancient lineage that was never domesticated at all. The animals that avoided domestication or were simply never targeted for it are the ones clinging to survival in the desert, and their behavior is revealing. Wild Bactrian camels are profoundly wary of humans. They flee at distances of several kilometers when they detect human presence, long before a person could get close enough to study them without optics. They avoid settlements, roads, and domestic livestock herds. They drink saline water from mineral springs that domestic camels and other livestock refuse to touch, a strategy that may have evolved specifically to keep them separated from managed animals and the humans who manage them. Their entire survival strategy in the modern world is built on one principle: stay away from people. These are not animals that chose to be near humans. They are animals that survived precisely because they stayed as far away as possible. So what does the behavioral evidence tell us about the lineage that did become domestic? Camels are, by any objective measure, among the most difficult domesticated animals on Earth. Anyone who has worked closely with them will confirm this without hesitation. They bite, and their bites are capable of crushing bone. They spit a foul mixture of stomach contents and saliva with startling accuracy across several meters. They kick with enough force to kill a person. They hold grudges. Camel handlers across the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia have reported for centuries that a camel mistreated by a specific person will remember that individual and retaliate days, weeks, sometimes months later. There are documented accounts of camels waiting until a handler falls asleep before attacking. And if you are wondering how that is even possible in a supposedly domesticated animal, so is everyone who has ever studied camel cognition. This is not the behavioral profile of an animal that's self-domesticated. Dogs show clear signs of what biologists call domestication syndrome, a suite of traits that includes reduced fear of humans, floppy ears, shortened snouts, juvenilized behavior, and reduced adrenal gland size. These traits cluster together because they are linked to neural crest cell development, and they emerge naturally in populations that self-select for tameness over many generations. Dogs, and to a lesser extent cats, show pronounced domestication syndrome because they were drawn to human environments voluntarily. The selection pressure was tolerance of proximity, not physical coercion. Camels show almost none of this. Domestic camels have not developed floppy ears. Their snouts have not shortened. Their adrenal stress response to perceived threats is fully intact. A domestic camel that feels threatened or mistreated will react with the same intensity as any wild animal. The same biting, kicking, spitting, and strategic delayed aggression. What selective breeding has produced is not tameness, but specific utilitarian traits. Higher milk yield, greater endurance under load, tolerance of heavier cargo, tractability under experienced handling by a person the animal has learned to accept. But the underlying wildness has not been bred out. It has merely been managed, one animal at a time, one handler at a time, day after day. Ilse Kohler-Rolfsson, a veterinarian and anthropologist who has spent decades studying camel pastoralism among the Rika herding communities of Rajasthan and India, described the relationship between camels and their human handlers as fundamentally different from the bond between humans and any other domestic animal. She noted that camels require individualized attention, that each animal has a distinct personality that the handler must learn and respect, and that the cooperation of a camel is never guaranteed. It must be earned, animal by animal, season by season. A horse can be broken. A camel, Kohler-Rolfsson observed, must be convinced. If you are finding this useful, subscribe now. Every week, this channel covers another piece of the deep past that changes how you understand the world you inherited. While the question of how camels were domesticated remains only partially resolved, the question of what happened after domestication is staggeringly clear. Because the camel did not just change how humans traveled, it changed which civilizations survived and which ones collapsed into isolation. The Arabian Peninsula before camel domestication was a wall. The interior desert, the Rub al-Khali, known in English as the Empty Quarter, covers roughly 650,000 square kilometers, an area larger than the entire country of France. Surface temperatures can reach 56 degrees Celsius. Rainfall in some zones averages less than 30 millimeters per year, roughly the amount of water in a single tall drinking glass spread across an entire square meter of ground. No human being could cross it on foot, carrying enough water to survive the journey. For thousands of years, the civilizations on either side of this desert, the Mesopotamian cultures to the north and the coastal societies of Yemen and Oman to the south, were effectively cut off from each other by a barrier of heat and sand that might as well have been an ocean. The domesticated dromedary eliminated that barrier entirely. A loaded dromedary can travel 40 kilometers per day across open desert while carrying up to 450 kilograms of cargo, roughly the weight of a grand piano and 2 adult human beings combined. It can go without water for periods of up to 15 days under favorable conditions, and when it finally reaches a water source, it can consume 200 liters in under 15 minutes, enough to fill a standard bathtub from empty to overflowing. It can lose up to 25% of its body weight through dehydration and continue functioning. A human being typically dies after losing 12 to 14%. That margin, the gap between the camel's threshold and ours, is the margin that made desert trade routes possible. By approximately 1000 BCE, the incense trade routes of the Arabian Peninsula were operational, and they depended entirely on the domesticated dromedary. Frankincense, harvested from boswellia trees growing in the mountains of southern Oman and Yemen, was among the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. It was burned in Egyptian temples, Roman homes, and Mesopotamian palaces. Greek physicians used it in medicinal preparations. The demand was enormous, spanning entire civilizations and centuries. And the only way to move it from the remote mountain valleys where the trees grew to the Mediterranean markets where it sold for more than its weight in gold was by camel caravan, through some of the harshest terrain on Earth, along routes that stretched over 2,000 kilometers, roughly the distance from London to Istanbul. The wealth generated by these trade routes did not just enrich individuals, it built entire civilizations from scratch. The Nabateans, who controlled the northern terminus of the incense trade from their capital at Petra in modern-day Jordan, carved an entire city into sandstone cliffs and accumulated wealth that rivaled the great Mediterranean powers of their era. Petra's famous treasury building, the Al-Khazaneh, with its intricately carved facade standing roughly 40 meters tall, about the height of a 12-story building, was financed by the tariffs collected on camel caravans passing through Nabatean territory. Without camels, that building does not exist. Without camels, the Nabatean civilization does not exist. Without camels, the economic connections linking the incense-producing south to the consuming empires of the north simply do not form. The timing of the camel's integration into this region has produced one of the more pointed archaeological controversies of the past decade. In 2014, archaeologists Erez Ben Yosef and Lidar Sapir Hen of Tel Aviv University published a study examining camel bones excavated from copper smelting sites in the Arava Valley in southern Israel. Using radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis, they determined that domesticated camels did not appear in the southern Levant until approximately 930 to 900 BCE, centuries later than the biblical texts suggest. The Book of Genesis describes Abraham, traditionally dated to roughly 2000 BCE, as possessing camels. But the archaeological record from that region and period contains no camel bones in domestic contexts. The camels in Genesis are, according to the evidence, an anachronism. A detail inserted by later authors and editors who lived in a period when the camel had already become ubiquitous, and who could not imagine a wealthy patriarch without the animal that had by their time become the defining symbol of desert commerce and elite status. This does not diminish the historical significance of the patriarchal narratives. But it reveals something important about how deeply the camel had penetrated human consciousness by the first millennium BCE. The writers who compiled the biblical text lived in a world so thoroughly shaped by the camel that they projected it backward into eras where it did not belong. The camel had become invisible through ubiquity. It was so embedded in the economy, the culture, and the daily assumptions of ancient Near Eastern life that its absence from an earlier period was literally unimaginable to the people writing the history. The Silk Road tells a parallel story at a larger scale. The vast network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, operational in organized form from roughly the 2nd century BCE onward, relied heavily on the Bactrian camel for its Central Asian segments. Where the dromedary conquered heat, the Bactrian camel conquered cold. Its thick, double-layered coat could withstand winter temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius on the high plateaus of Central Asia, conditions that would kill an unprotected human in hours. Its wide, tough feet gripped rocky mountain passes and loose gravel, with a stability that horses and donkeys could not match when loaded. Its endurance under load across vast, featureless terrain, day after day, week after week, was unmatched by any other draft animal available. Without the Bactrian camel, the overland Silk Road does not function at the scale it reached. The exchange of silk, spices, precious metals, glass, paper, gunpowder, and ideas between East Asia and the Mediterranean slows to a trickle. The spread of Buddhism from India to China follows different channels and different timescales. The transmission of papermaking technology from Chinese artisans to the Islamic world and from there to Europe, happens later or not at all. The movement of plague along Eurasian trade routes, including the Black Death, follows different vectors. Consider what that means. World-altering exchanges of goods, technologies, religions, and diseases depended at a logistical level on an animal that evolved in North America, migrated to Asia 7 million years ago, survived an Arctic epoch that no human ever witnessed, and was domesticated by people who had no understanding of where it came from, how old its lineage was, or how far it had already traveled before they ever laid a hand on it. The camel's contribution to human civilization was not given willingly. It was not offered as a gift from a grateful animal to a clever species. It was extracted, over millennia, from a creature that never stopped resisting the arrangement. And the extraction succeeded only because the camel was, through no intention of its own, already equipped for the job. Its body had been built for something else entirely. For crossing frozen tundra in perpetual darkness. For surviving seasons when food vanished and temperatures plunged. For enduring conditions so extreme that most of the planet's mammals would not have lasted a week. Meanwhile, in the Gobi Desert, the animals that were never domesticated continue to run. The wild Bactrian camels of the Transaltai Gobi and the Lop Nur have survived nuclear weapons testing, prolonged drought, competition with domestic livestock for dwindling grazing land, and centuries of hunting by humans who considered them a nuisance or a food source. The Chinese nuclear test site at Lop Nur, where 45 atmospheric and underground nuclear devices were detonated between 1964 and 1996, sits squarely in the middle of their remaining range. The wild camels did not leave. They adapted to drinking the saline, possibly contaminated water from springs in the test zone, water so laden with minerals and dissolved salts that domestic camels and other livestock refused to go near it. John Hare, a British explorer and conservationist who dedicated decades to studying wild Bactrian camels in some of the most remote terrain on Earth, described them as among the hardiest large mammals alive. His expeditions into the Lop Nur wasteland documented animals surviving conditions that would kill most domestic livestock within days. He established the Wild Camel Protection Foundation in 1997 and worked with Chinese and Mongolian authorities to create the Lop Nur Wild Camel National Nature Reserve, covering over 67,000 square kilometers of desert, roughly the size of Ireland. But the protection may not be enough. Hybridization with domestic Bactrian camels is the most immediate genetic threat. When domestic males wander into wild camel territory and breed with wild females, the offspring carry domestic genes into the wild population. Slowly, generation by generation, the genetic distinctness that has been maintained for nearly 1 million years erodes. Mining operations in both Mongolia and China encroach on the sparse grazing land that the wild population depends on. Climate change is altering the seasonal patterns of the vegetation and water sources that sustain them. If the wild Bactrian camel goes extinct, and the trajectory suggests this is more likely than not within this century, it will mean that both lineages of wild camel on Earth, the wild dromedary and the wild Bactrian, will have been erased during the period of human dominance. One consumed entirely by domestication, absorbed so completely into managed herds that not a single wild individual survived. The other, starved by it, pushed into ever-shrinking pockets of wasteland too harsh for the domestic herds that took its grazing land. And so we return to the question: did camels choose to carry us, or did we break them in? The evidence does not support the version of the story that humans prefer to tell about their relationships with animals. Dogs may have chosen us. There is credible evidence that wolves with lower fear thresholds gravitated toward human camps, scavenged waste, and over thousands of years became our companions through a process of genuine mutual benefit. Cats almost certainly chose us, arriving at grain stores to hunt the rodents attracted by early agriculture, tolerated by humans who benefited from the pest control, and gradually accepting a domestic role that asked almost nothing of them beyond proximity. Camels did neither. The genetic evidence shows no voluntary migration toward human settlements. The behavioral evidence shows an animal that has never fully accepted human authority, that retaliates when mistreated, that must be individually convinced to cooperate rather than trained into obedience. The archaeological evidence shows a transition from hunting to management that was gradual, coercive, and driven entirely by human economic need. The wild populations that survived domestication did so specifically by fleeing from contact with humans and drinking water that humans could not use. Everything points in one direction. We broke them in, slowly, over centuries, with a persistence that matched their stubbornness and eventually exceeded it. We did not earn their loyalty, we earned their tolerance. And even that tolerance comes with conditions that every experienced camel handler in the world understands. Treat the animal as an individual, learn its specific temperament, respect its moods, and never, under any circumstances, assume that its cooperation today guarantees its cooperation tomorrow. The camel carries us not because it chose to, but because 45 million years of evolution constructed an animal so durable, so efficient, and so magnificently over-engineered for survival that even after we captured it, confined it, bred it for our purposes, and drove its wild ancestors to extinction, it still works. It works because it was built for something harder than carrying a human across a desert. It was built for crossing a frozen continent in the dark, in a world where the sun did not rise for months, where food vanished beneath snow, and where only the most brutally adapted survived. The real question is not whether camels chose us or we broke them in. The real question is what it tells us about the nature of domestication itself, that the most important partnership in the history of desert civilization was never actually a partnership. It was an arrangement. One side needed something it could not build. The other side endured something it could not escape. And the only members of the camelid family that stayed free are the ones disappearing in the Gobi right now, drinking water nothing else will touch, running from the sound of engines across a desert that used to belong entirely to them. Every time a camel kneels under a load somewhere in the Sahara or the Thar or the Arabian Peninsula, remember that its body was designed for a world you will never see. A world of boreal forests at the top of the planet, 3.5 million years before anyone asked it to kneel. It did not volunteer. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now.